Good afternoon, students. This is Dr. Pooja Gupta, HOD, School of Medical and Paramedical Sciences, ITM University, Kolkata. So, our today's topic is thoracic cage. Okay, we'll learn about the how the thoracic cage is made and what are the bones involved in the thoracic cage and what are the functions of thoracic cage. Okay, so let's start with the thoracic cage. So, what are the components of thoracic cage? So, these components of thoracic cage are the sternum, that is consist of manubrium sterni, that is called as manubrium, the body, gladiolus, and xiphoid process. Okay, so the sternum is made of three parts. The manubrium, that is called as the manubrium sterni, the body is called gladiolus, and the xiphoid process. Okay, the end is called as the xiphoid process. Now, next is the ribs. What are the ribs? There are 7 true ribs. There are 12 pair of ribs actually. There are 12 pair of ribs which are present in thoracic cage. So there are the 7 are called as the true ribs, and 5 the lower one are called as the false ribs, including the 2 floating ribs. 2 pair actually. These ribs are in the pairs. So there are 7 pairs of true ribs and 5 pairs of false ribs, including 2 pair of floating ribs. And the clavicle and scapula forms this pectoral girdle, and 12 thoracic vertebrae from T1 to T12. These are the from sternum, ribs, the pectoral girdle, bones like clavicle, scapula, and the thoracic vertebrae. These all forms the 12 thoracic vertebrae. These all forms the what you can say the bony structure of thoracic cage. Okay, now next is, so you can see here in the picture. As you can see in the picture, there is from this front, as you can see from the front, there is sternum. Here you can see this sternum. See this. Okay, now you can see this is the sternum part. Okay, so this is the sternum. Okay, this is sternum, and this is your manubrium sterni. This is the body, gladiolus, and last one is the xiphisternum. Then upper 7 is the pair of ribs which are called as true ribs, which are called as true ribs. So as you can see, sternum we have seen. Now see, these are the ribs. The first 7 ribs are true ribs. Okay, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 3 these ribs. Okay, and 2 pair of floating ribs. These are the false ribs. False ribs I'll by blue. These are the false ribs. The 2 pair of floating ribs, and 7 are true ribs. Now the other bones are the pectoral girdle bones, like this is clavicle, and at the back there is scapula, fine, and there is this from posterior view, if you can see, this is T12, okay, and here is T1. So the 12 pair sternum, whole sternum with manubrium sterni, body, gladiolus, and the xiphisternum. The 12 pair of ribs, in which 7 are true ribs and 5 are false ribs, including 2 pair of floating ribs. Okay, next is the pectoral girdle bones like clavicle and scapula, and the 12 pair of and the T1 to T12 thoracic vertebrae. So these are the cartilage, or what you can say the bones of the thoracic cage. Fine. Now next is thoracic cage. It forms a conical enclosure for the lungs and heart and provides attachment for the pectoral girdle and upper limb. Okay, so it has basically thoracic cage is a conical structure, conical enclosure which is responsible for the protection of lungs and heart. The basic important function of thoracic cage is it protects your lungs and heart, both the vital organ of your human body, and it provides attachment to the pectoral girdle and upper limb. See, your upper limb is attached and your pectoral girdle is attached to the body, your axial skeleton, through these pectoral bones, the clavicle and the scapula. So this is and it has a broad base and a narrow superior apex. Okay, and it is rhythmically expanded by respiratory muscles to create a vacuum that draws air into the lungs. Basically, it's a conical narrow superior apex. So it's a rhythmically expanded by the respiratory muscles to create a vacuum that draws air into the lungs. Okay. The inferior border of the thoracic cage is formed by a downward arc of the ribs called costal margin. The ribs protect the thoracic organs and spleen, most of the liver, and to some extent the kidneys. Okay, so the ribs protect the thoracic organs like the lungs and the heart basically, and the spleen and most of the liver, and to some extent the kidneys also. Okay, now this is about the sternum, the various bones and details. The sternum are also called as breastbone. Okay, so this is a flat bone with three parts. Okay, the first is the manubrium sterni, next is the body of the sternum, that is gladiolus, and the other is, last one is the xiphisternum or xiphoid process. It is also called as xiphoid process or xiphisternum. Okay, now the various other parts related to the sternum bone is the suprasternal notch. Okay, facet for the clavicle, facet for the fourth costal cartilage, change the color, and facet for the second costal cartilage. This is at the junction of the manubrium sterni and the body here. Okay, now facet for the third costal cartilage, all is well defined and marked. Then for the fourth costal cartilage, then for the fifth costal cartilage, then for the sixth costal cartilage, and then for the seventh costal cartilage. Okay, so these 7 costal cartilages first, and then these costal cartilages are attached to the ribs. Then these costal cartilages attached to the ribs. Now we'll study the costal cartilage in detail in the next slides. Okay, so these are the 7 costal cartilages. There's impression facets for the 7 costal cartilages because the 7 ribs are true ribs. The upper 7 ribs are true ribs and lower 3 are attached to this 7th costal cartilage only, so they are called as false ribs, and the 2 pair of floating ribs also. Okay, fine. Now the next is, you can see the parts of sternum in detail, the manubrium sterni, jugular or suprasternal notch, same thing. Okay, suprasternal notch here, then articulates with the clavicles and ribs of first and second. Okay, it articulates with clavicles on both the sides and the ribs of rib at the first and second. Here at the clavicle, and here to the first rib, and here to the second rib. Okay, then lies opposite to T3 and T4 vertebrae. Fine, this is lies opposite to the T4 and T3 vertebrae. And next is the manubrium sternal joint. Sternomanubrium joint is called the sternal angle or the angle of flow, is opposite articulation with second rib and at the level of intervertebral disc between T4 and T5 vertebrae, important for counting the ribs. Okay, so these are this is about the manubrum sterni, the detail of the all the manubrum sterni. Next is parts of the next part is the body or the glandulus, articulates with the 2nd to 7th rib, and ziphisternal joint inferiorly opposite to the T7 vertebrae. Okay, opposite to T9 vertebra, ziphisternal joint at the end. Here at the end you can see this is the ziphisternum. It's inferiorly opposite to the T9. Okay, and the xiphoid process, here is the this is the xiphoid process. So it's a cartilaginous calcifies through time, and it allows attachment of muscles tip of the xiphoid process at the level of T10. So these are the parts of the sternum. Okay, so next is, you can see in the lateral view, in the lateral view you can see here the facets for the vertebrae, the for costal cartilages. You can see here the facets for the costal cartilages, the articular site for clavicle, the 4th rib, 2nd rib, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th rib. So then the jugular notch, manubrum sternum, sternal angle, transverse ridges, body of sternum, and the xiphoid process. Okay, as you can see in the picture. Now next is the clinical anatomy related to this is the bone marrow biopsy, to take sample of bone marrow. It is the site for the bone marrow biopsy. Okay, for various marrow cancers or carcinomas and other infections, they take bone marrow from this area. And the median sternotomy, it is a split sternum, that is the sternum is split into half longitudinally to gain access to thoracic organs for surgery. Okay, in bypass, commonly in the bypass surgeries, this median sternotomy is done at the middle of the sternum. Okay, now next is the you can see the sternocostal joints. Sternocostal joints, you can see here the sternum is attached to the costal cartilages. Here you can see the sternum is attached to the costal cartilages. Okay, so this blue colored structures are the costal cartilages. These are costal cartilages through which the ribs are attached to the sternum. So these are called as the costal cartilages. Fine. These are the costal cartilages which are attached to the ribs through the sternum. Next is ribs. Now the typical ribs, there are typical ribs. Typical ribs are from the second number of ribs to the 7th rib. They are called as the typical ribs. So they have head, neck, tubercle, angle, shaft and subcostal groove. These are common to all the ribs from rib number 2 to 7. Okay, they have head, neck, tubercle, angle, shaft and subcostal groove. And atypical ribs are 1st and 8th to 10th. Okay, and 11th and 12th are the floating ribs. So they do not articulate with the transverse processes of the vertebrae or sternum, of vertebrae or sternum. Okay, so the atypical ribs, the rib number 1 has short, flat and supports subclavian vessels. It's the first rib at the neck level. Okay, and the rib 1 and 10 to 12 articulate only with one vertebrae. Okay, that's why they are atypical to the rib number 1 and 10, 11 and 12. They articulate with the one vertebrae only. Otherwise, other vertebrae, other ribs articulate with the more than one, that is to 2 vertebrae. Okay, now you can see here typical ribs, these 7 pairs of ribs are attached anterior to the sternum by their costal cartilages. Okay, atypical ribs, 8th, 9th and 10th pairs of ribs are attached anteriorly to each other and to the 7th rib by means of their costal cartilages and small synovial joints. Here, okay, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th ribs. Okay, Now floating ribs, the 11th and 12th pairs have no anterior attachment. They are embedded in the abdominal muscles. Okay, they are embedded in the abdominal muscles. Now, typical ribs. So typical ribs are from 2 to 7. They are long and twisted flat bone. Okay. The anterior end of each rib is attached to the corresponding costal cartilages. A rib has a head, neck, tubercle, shaft and angle. Okay, and head located posteriorly has two facets of articulation, one for the numerically corresponding vertebral body and other for the vertebral body immediately above it. Neck is constricted portion between the head and the tubercle. The tubercle is a prominence on outer surface of the rib at the junction of neck with the shaft. Okay, it has a facet for articulation with the transverse processes of the numerically corresponding vertebrae. Fine. And the shaft is thin, flat and twisted on its long axis. It has a rounded, smooth superior border and a sharp, thin inferior border which has a costal groove. It accommodates the intercostal vessels and nerve. The angle is where the shaft of the rib bends sharply forward. So this is all about the typical ribs from 2 to 7, the various structures they have: head, neck, tubercle, shaft, costal groove and the angle. Okay, and they are the long twisted flat bones. So you can see here in the picture the head. This is the head. Okay, fine. So here you can see the head. Okay, head, then is the neck. Fine. There is the articular part of the tubercle which attached to the transverse process, which get articulated with the transverse process. Then it is the non-articular part of the tubercle. Then this is rounded superior border. This is the rounded superior border here. Okay, this is the angle from which it takes the turn. That is called as the angle. Fine. And below that there is this costal groove. Groove is present inferiorly. That is called as the costal groove, and the sharp inferior border here. Fine. And the domifacet of the vertebral body here. Fine. And the domifacet of the vertebral body here. So it is attached to the two vertebral bodies, upper and down. Fine. One rib is attached to the two vertebral bodies. Now you can see here. Next is the the posterior head, tubercle, angle. Same thing is there, and it's in a different view. Fine. And now there are the vertebral bodies. See, the vertebral bodies are attached, and the attachments. The thoracic vertebrae, basically the T1 to T12 were thoracic vertebrae. So this is the thoracic vertebrae. Okay. So this is the vertebrae, thoracic, the body. It has a broad body. Okay, vertebral canal, the transverse processes, the spinous processes, and the facets over the transverse processes, the facets of the superior articular process and the inferior articular process. Fine. And you can see the domifacets of articulation with the head of the ribs. You can see here these are the domiculation for the head of the ribs. These both are the fine. And there's you can see facet for the articulation with the tubercle of the rib here, and the superior articular process. These are the superior and the inferior articular process. Fine. And these are the transverse processes on both the sides. The spinous processes, this vertebral canal, the body of the vertebrae. Fine. And this again shown in the lateral view and the superior view. Okay. Now next is the how the rib is got attached to this, how it is attached. So you can see here in the front it is attached to the sternum here, like this is the example of is the example of fifth rib. Fine. So it's an example of fifth rib. See, you can see at the front these costal cartilages. Costal cartilages is attached to the body of the sternum. Okay, and then there is, this is the costal cartilages. So, and this is your body of the sternum. This is the angle of your rib, and the tubercle of the rib is attaching to the transverse processes, and then there is the neck of the rib here, and there is the head of the rib which is attaching to the upper and lower vertebrae like T4 and T5 vertebrae, because this is a fifth rib. So lower is the T5, the fifth thoracic vertebrae, and upper is the fourth thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so these are the attachments to the how the ribs are attached to the vertebrae, okay, and to the sternum, as you can see here on the both sides, how it is attached to the sternum, and we can see this in a skeleton also in the practical classes. So how these are attached to the sternum. So these are in importance while see these movement of ribs are important for the respiration basically. So they protect the organs, definitely the heart and lung, the various other, this is the most basic vital organs for human being, but it also has a process of respiration in which this ribs moves out, flares out when we inhale, deep inhale the air, okay, and the negative pressure inside the pleural cavity that brings about the inhalation of or the suction of air inside the lungs. Okay, so these are the ribs. Next is the, you can see here atypical rib. Now we'll talk about the atypical rib. Okay, the fourth rib. Now the fourth rib has a close relationship to the lower nerves of the brachial plexus, subclavian artery and vein. So it has a very close relationship with the nerves, the brachial plexus, the subclavian artery and the vein. And this rib is a small, flattened from above downward. Scalenus anterior muscle is the attachments to its upper surface and inner border. Okay, anterior to the attachment of scalenus is the anterior subclavian vein that crosses the rib. Fine. So this is about the first atypical fourth rib, because it has attached close relationship with the brachial plexus. That is a very important part. So fourth rib is and the subclavian artery, which supplies the head and the upper limb. The branches of the subclavian artery supplies the upper limb and the head and your brain basically. So any sort of problem in the fourth rib may cause neurological symptoms in the brachial plexus and the various vascular symptoms in your head, and this is sometimes it may be fatal also if got any injury, and which reduces the blood flow to the brain. Okay, so clinical anatomy related to fourth rib, the fracture of fourth rib, this was I was talking about. The fracture of fourth rib may cause the injury to the lower trunk of brachial plexus, that is the Klumpke's paralysis. Okay, that is called as the Klumpke's paralysis. And the injury to the subclavian vessels, that is hemorrhage or ischemia. Okay, the hemorrhage or ischemia may be caused by the fracture, because of the fracture of the fourth rib. Okay, now the other symptom is the thoracic outlet syndrome, that is the compression of subclavian vessels or brachial plexus between the fourth rib and the clavicle. So this thoracic outlet syndrome may cause the Klumpke's paralysis along with the ischemia. So both are very what you can say debilitating conditions in which there is Klumpke's paralysis, because it's a injury to the lower trunk. Okay, and we have gone through this. We have already studied the Klumpke's paralysis in the brachial plexus injury and brachial plexus in its clinical anatomy. And ischemia is definitely when there is reduced blood flow to any part in which the vessels are supplying, this subclavian arteries are supplying. So this ischemia is due because of the reduced blood supply to the areas. Okay, so that is the ischemia. So next is the, as you can see, this is the first rib. This is the, so this is the first rib, the costal cartilages, the scalenate tubercle, the grooves, the head neck tubercle. This is the first rib. Okay, the typical first rib. So it's smaller, the smallest of all the ribs, and it is it's more curved one. Okay, now we'll go for the that's all about the bones of the thoracic cage. Now there is joints. So we'll deal with the joints of the thoracic cage. The first one is the joints of sternum. So joints of sternum, when the sternum is attached to the various structures. So say the manubriosternal joint. First one is it's a cartilaginous joint. Manubrum is attached to the body of the sternum. Here this is the joint between the manubrum and the body of the sternum. That's why it's called as manubriosternal joint. Okay, now the xiphisternal joint, that is the cartilaginous joint between xiphoid process and the body of sternum. Okay, xiphisternum, this is xiphoid process and the sternum, so that was xiphisternal joint. Okay, and the xiphoid process usually fuses with the body of the sternum during the middle ages. During the middle age, it gets fuses with the xiphoid process. So, is the manubriosternal joint and the xiphisternal joint. Okay, now the joints of ribs. So joints of ribs are the costovertebral joints, first one, where the two joints between the head of the ribs and the bodies of vertebra. So at the back is the corresponding and upper. So at the back, what happens? The head of the vertebra joint, this ribs, is attached to the upper vertebrae, and the lower vertebrae is the same as if for example, if fifth vertebrae is the joints between the fifth vertebrae, the costovertebral joints of the fifth vertebrae is the corresponding fifth thoracic vertebrae, and the upper one means the fourth thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so the two joints between the heads of the ribs and the bodies of vertebrae, that is it, and these are the synovial type of joints. So first, 10th, 11th and 12th rib has one synovial joint with the corresponding vertebra, and the rest have two each, one for the corresponding vertebra and other for the vertebra above it. Okay, so first, 10th, 11th and 12th rib has one synovial joint with the corresponding vertebra. Okay, so one joint between the tubercle of ribs and transverse process of vertebra corresponding is the synovial joint, that is first to 10th rib. Intra-articular ligament connects head of the rib to the antevertebral disc. Okay, so these are the joints of the, see here you can see in the picture how the vertebra, how the rib is attaching to the two ribs. From the lower one is the same as the number of the rib which is attaching to it, and the upper one is the bone which is above it. You can see in the inset also the disc, the lower thoracic vertebrae and the upper thoracic vertebrae, and the interarticular ligament between the vertebrae and the rib. Okay, vertebra above, below, and the joint capsule also, because it's a synovial type joint. The superior costotransverse ligament and the costotransverse joint, that is joint with the vertebral body, and lateral costotransverse ligament. Fine. Now next is the joint of the ribs is the costochondral joints, that is the joints of the ribs with the costal cartilages, and that are cartilages joints, and the sternocostal joints between the sternum and the costal cartilages, that is the first cartilaginous joint, second and 10th synovial joint, second and to 7th costal cartilages with sternum, 8 to 10 costal cartilages with each other, and 11th to 12th costal cartilages are embedded in the muscles. Okay, so these are the, as you can see, fine, the joints you can see here, the costal cartilages joints, you can zoom it and see here, see how the costal cartilages, the blue colored, they are attached to the ribs. Then there is next is the movements. Okay, this is very important because the cartilaginous joints are immobile. Cartilaginous joints are immobile. That is the fourth rib, and all costochondral joints do not move during respiration. See, costochondral joint doesn't move during respiration. Okay, so synovial joints are slightly mobile due to movements in both the joints between head and the tubercle and the vertebrae. Neck of the ribs rotate along their axis, helping in raising the lower of ribs during respiration. See, this is important. So these synovial joints between the ribs and the vertebrae, due to the movements of both the joints between head, tubercle and vertebrae, neck of the ribs rotate along their axis, helping in raising and lowering the ribs during respiration. Okay, so this cartilaginous joints are immobile, that is the fourth rib, and all the costochondral joints do not move during respiration, but this synovial joints slightly move during respiration. Okay, now the cartilaginous joint, next is it's the same. Next is, so these are the movements and the various uh, things that you all about the all that's all about the thoracic cage, the bones which are present, the details of bones, what are the joints, and what are the movements present between the various bones. Okay, and how they are helping in the respiration and protecting the other organs. I think that's all about the thoracic cage. That's it, I think. Thank you so much. Thank you.